Hi there, and thanks for coming to look at my 5 questions on Night Stalkers #1, The Night Is Mine. Warning, there are spoilers, so let's jump right in. First, I want to talk about the origins of characters. People are always asking me, oh, where'd you find this character? I have no idea where I found Emily. She's the one of the very few characters. She walked on to the set fully formed. She knew what she wanted. She knew who she was. In a lot of ways, I was just along for the ride. And this was my first breakout novel. This is the first one that really started to sell. and But I'd written about 6 novels before that, so it was like, okay, this character, and I'd been thinking about this series for a long time. If you watch the Origins video, I may have mentioned I did about 4 years of research thinking about this story and how I wanted to tell it and where it might go. And by the time I got there, Emily walked onto the scene, flew in on her helicopter, shot the laptop, and she was off and rolling. Mark was much trickier. Mark came in and he started out as a cliche. He was, Mr. Cool, perfect commander, and that was going to be his look and his role and who he was. And it took me a long time to discover, it took me several drafts to discover who he was as a person and that he wore that as armor. He wore it as a shield, and that it's so deep, even in later books, after he's evolved, after he does another job, after he retires, he still is that persona. And we only see that crack a few times. And one of the places it cracks is around Emily. Uh, One of the odd things about this book was I didn't know what I'd written. So it actually started out, there's another character, Daniel Drake Darlington III, who is the assistant to the First Lady. And I had him in the first couple drafts. He was a love triangle, actually a love quadrangle, because she was being courted by Mark, her commander, so that wasn't going to fly. Daniel, who was just Mr. Handsome, pleasant, charming, intelligent guy working at the White House, and her childhood friend, who was 6 years older, but he was the neighbor, and she was really precocious, so they got along really well, who is now the serving president, Peter. So it's supposed to be this whole 4-way knotted up thing with Emily trapped in the middle of this triangular crossfire between the 3 men. That all kind of went away. It kept distracting from the core, and so it finally got tossed aside. One other weird little note is there's a typo that ended up creating a whole series. And the typo is Henderson's. Mark Henderson is the commander of the 5th Battalion D Company. And what happened was it should have been Henderson's apostrophe. There's a photo he has of his family standing under the banner over their Montana ranch. And, those arched wooden signs. And on the arched wooden sign, I had it read apostrophe S singular instead of S apostrophe. I didn't notice this for years. I kept typing along Henderson, so this, and mentioning the ranch. And finally, a fan said, 3 of them live there. Mom, Dad, and Mark. Why is it singular? And that ended up creating the Henderson's Ranch series, which was all about which started out me trying to answer that question of why was it singular. So it's fun. That's how writing works. You never know where the next idea is going to come from. So one of the challenges with this book was learning to romance. When I wrote this, I didn't know what I'd written. I might have been a romance, might have been a love story, kind of a thriller. I didn't know. I was a beginning writer. I had 5 or 6 books that I knew what they were, but science fiction, fantasy, contemporary romance. This was something new for me. And it went through a number of names, first Chef, Into the Frying Pan, and then my editor said, no, no, we need a double entendre. We need a double entendre. And so it became Hard Lift before it finally became The Night Is Mine. And the way I discovered romance was I had a publisher of my very first fantasy novel who took a bunch of authors to Romance Writers of America National Conference. And she took 4 men to prove that men write romance. A small detail none of us did, but she wanted to make a name for herself and prove that. So there we are, 1,800 women who are very serious about the business of writing romance. It's a huge, huge thing. No matter how much people might want to poo-poo it, it's really big. And excuse the mic that's intruding into my space here. And 7 guys, 2 of whom were boyfriends keeping their girlfriends company, 4 of us that she brought, and 1 guy who actually made his living as a romance writer. This was 1996. So that's where I started trying to put more romance into the stories, which was really a good fit for me because I love MGM musicals and Broadway shows. I was raised on them. So it was a very natural fit, but I didn't discover romance till I'd been a writer for most of a decade. So I started working and building it up, and I talked in the prior book about how I built the Night Stalkers series. Well, I started sending it out, and I didn't know what I'd written, so I sent it out to thriller houses, romance houses, just action adventure. I didn't know. I was just sending it out, and finally I got the call, right? That call that all authors want. Hi, I'd like to buy your series. Tell me about it. And what she had was she had the opening of the first scene and a half-page synopsis. And she had just bought 2 other military series and had never heard of the Night Stalkers until she saw my book. And she was like, I want this book. So I told her about it, and she said, yeah, that's fine, but that's not a romance. And I said, okay. And there was this long pause on the phone. And I said, so tell me about it. And so we spent an hour and a half talking about what a romance was and wasn't. And I said, let me send you a redraft. So in the next 10 days, I threw out a third of the novel, redrafted it all, sent it back. And she went, what's this? I thought you were going to redraft it. And I said, that's it. It's done. It's in your hand. She called me back the next morning and said, I'm taking this here. You see, actually, she said, you're really close. You're really close. Fix this and this. So I like 10% more of the book went away. And I sent it back, and she went, this is it. I'm buying the series. So I had to go through these rounds of learning how to tell a romance and what I was missing, and that it's the emotion that drives the story, and it's the character that drives the story much more than the plot in a romance. Thriller is about plot and pace and keeping it moving. I think a good thriller is actually a lot about the character as well. A lot of thrillers just kind of blow through the character and focus on that plot and pacing thing. But having come out of romance, I love to delve into the characters, and it was a chance to really find out who they were and play with them. And I love that about this series. So I already mentioned Daniel as an accidental character. I needed a distraction. Emily's there. She's at the White House. She's suddenly standing in the First Lady's kitchen within 36 hours of flying a mission out on the edge of the envelope into the heart of the war in Afghanistan. And she is just lost. She has no idea what she's doing there. And I tried having the president come in. No, that was too much because there's all kinds of emotional baggage with the older boys she was enamored of next door. And I tried having the First Lady come in, but she's such a force of nature that she just disrupted everything. And so I had this guy named Daniel walk in, and he's just pleasant, intelligent, looks like a surfer. He's so handsome. And that's partly because he was supposed to be part of that love quadrangle thing. But Daniel really came into himself, and he ended up having his own novel. In He actually launched a series, the Night Stalkers holiday series, Daniel's Christmas, where he finds his own true love. Uh, so he was just a walk-on who I got to unravel and discover. And Peter was part of her he was her conflict with her past. He's the boy next door who was too old for her, 6 years older at that point. But he became a dominant force through the series. He's the president, but I never thought about involving the government. I thought about just involving that romance conflict. And he ended up being the president through the whole series and handing off the presidency. So he ended up having this huge legacy and effect on multiple series of the novel, because it broke off into other offshoots. The third one, who was born completely by accident in the series, is I needed one of the ways that you make a character impressive is you have the other characters say how impressive they are. And the more impressive the character who gives that opinion is, then the more weight their opinion carries. So I had Emily fly a mission, and she rescues this guy who doesn't trust a woman in forward combat. Emily's the first one. So Michael Gibson, Colonel Michael Gibson of Delta Force, starts out not trusting her and ends up gambling his life that she's as good as she says she is. And it works. She saves him. Michael ends up being one of those powerhouse through characters. And the crazy thing is that we'll talk about when we get to book number 6. Michael doesn't talk. He's Delta Force. So I have this character who almost never speaks, but is this huge anchor of what it means to be excellent. And so these accidental characters came in and ended up playing a huge role in Emily's life. So you're supposed to write what you know. That's what they always say. Write what you know. Write what you know. Hadn't flown in a helicopter until about book 7. I did fly a small plane, but my dream was to be a big airline pilot till I discovered I was partially colorblind, and they'd never let me pilot the big planes. So I knew a fair bit about flying. I'd studied it and dreamed about it and researched it. I knew nothing about war zones, so that's one of the reasons it took me 4 years to learn about the series. I suddenly had to start reading about those ongoing wars and what it was like to serve, and reading memoir and researching those. I had been to Washington, D.C., and that's actually how the White House got tucked in here, was my kid had a field trip, a class trip where they went to Washington, D.C. and the general area for, I think it was 7 or 8 days, and I went along as a parental escort. One of the things we did was we did the White House tour. We also did Library of Congress, Supreme Court, and we saw a lot of Washington Monument. We saw a lot of the key places. But it's what got me thinking. It's why the White House ended up being the main setting of this first book, because it was somewhere that was at least a little familiar. So I start in this war zone, but I get you out of there as fast as I can, and I do almost the whole rest of the book in the White House, because I'd been on this little half-hour tour that led us through the general public spaces. And that had gotten me researching the White House and learning more about the White House. So that's how this book got set where it was because I had walked those halls. The other halls I had to walk virtually. I had to study and research and talk to people. So writing about Emily was really interesting, because my premise was she was the woman who was so good they couldn't keep her out. She is the supreme soldier. And it eventually, one of my writing motto, my main writing motto, is to champion the human spirit. I want to show how incredible people can be. given the chance, even ordinary people, how they can just step beyond anything we would expect and be amazing. Well, in writing romance, I had to sit there and think about what's that next level. And it became strong women and the men they deserve. So who could live up to Emily's standard? Because she is one powerful woman. And the man she deserves is the best of them all, which is her commander. So I spent a lot of time reading about romances within the military and how those work and what the laws are about them, what the rules are about them. And I ended up bending them quite a bit to make the 5D function and make these romances function. They should never be in the same chain of command, because that sets up all kinds of conflicts. They can serve in side-by-side units, but not in the same chain of command. And so I made the 5D into 5th Battalion D Company, which is fake. The Night Stalkers only have 4 battalions. Until recently, there was a rumor they were standing up a 5th, but I wrote this over a decade ago, and there were only 4. So the 5th Battalion D Company that he commands, I have them make it an experiment in what happens if we let people serve together. And that was sort of the premise that I carried through all the books. The roles I'll talk about a lot as we go through the next several books. But I've heard women talk about they had to choose the role they wanted to play in the man's world. How are you going to survive as a woman, especially in an extremely male-dominated thing like Special Operations Forces, but even in the world of science and so on? And the women I've talked to, they talk about they choose a role. So Emily's was to be the best, be better than the best. Take them on one-on-one. I'm as good as any man standing around. And when you meet Keith Smith in the next book, hers was, I'm the sex kitten, because that's a distraction. So all the guys pay attention to the sex kitten, and she comes in at them sideways. There's the little sister, there's the rebel, there are all these different roles that women have been forced to take in our society to do well and to carry through and succeed. Emily's role was the head-on, I'm as good as you are, and boy, am I going to prove it. And she does. And I think that may be much of what her origin was proving that. And that's her strength. She goes from being the best warrior to also being the best mentor, to being the mother guide to all of the women who come after her. She's the mentor and helps take care of them and make them be their best selves. And I love that about Emily. I wish I could write another one of her. She's just so fun, and I wish I knew how I created her. I've tried to create another one like her, and haven't yet, but it doesn't mean I'm going to stop trying anytime soon. Thanks so much for joining me. Go visit mlbuchman.com. That's MLBUCHMAN. And there's all the books are there, newsletters. You can contact me if you have another question. There's also bonus scenes, including for this story, for this novel. There's a bonus scene. There's a recipe from the book, maps of where they were, all kinds of good stuff. So thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed it. Take care.